When World War II began in 1939, the world imagined tanks, bombs, soldiers, and front lines. But behind every front line, there was another silent battlefield, one where millions of women fought a war they never signed up for. This is the story of how World War II became a nightmare for women everywhere. As the men marched off to fight, entire societies collapsed onto the shoulders of women. Factories that once belonged to skilled male workers now depended on mothers, daughters, and widows. They worked 14-hour shifts, inhaling dust and chemicals, building weapons powerful enough to destroy cities, yet earning half the wages men received. Their hands built the machines of war, but their sacrifices rarely made the headlines. In Eastern Europe, the nightmare reached a terrifying scale. When armies invaded villages, women were often the first targets. Homes became prisons, streets turned into hunting grounds. Countless women were subjected to violence so brutal that many refused to speak of it for the rest of their lives. For them, the war didn't just destroy cities, it shattered their sense of safety forever. In Nazi-occupied territories, women faced a different horror: forced labor camps. They were starved, beaten, and worked until their bodies collapsed, all while living with the fear that tomorrow might be their last day. Many were separated from their children and forced to watch their families disappear behind barbed wire. Meanwhile, in Japan's empire, thousands of women, many still teenagers, were taken from Korea, China, and the Philippines and forced into comfort stations. These women lived through cruelty that defies imagination. Their suffering remained hidden for decades, buried beneath politics and silence. Even in Allied countries, women weren't truly safe. While they played a crucial role as nurses, code breakers, and resistance fighters, they also endured constant discrimination. They stepped into dangerous roles, saved lives, and served their nations, only to be pushed aside when the war ended, told to return to the kitchen as if their courage had never mattered. World War II changed the world, but for women, it carved scars that would last generations. Behind every victory parade and historical photograph lies a story of a woman who survived hunger, fear, and violence, and whose strength kept nations standing. This is why World War II wasn't just a military conflict. For millions of women, it was a nightmare they lived through in silence. A nightmare the world is only now beginning to understand. When survival became a daily battle for women trapped inside the war zones of Europe and Asia, survival was not a single moment. It was a routine, repeated every sunrise. As armies advanced and borders crumbled, daily life for women transformed into a constant negotiation between hunger, fear, and hope. Food became the first enemy. With men gone and farmlands destroyed, mothers stood in endless lines, hoping to receive a few grams of bread. Some walked miles through bombed streets just to find clean water. Many sacrificed their own meals so their children could live one more day. Hunger didn't just weaken bodies, it broke spirits, slowly and painfully. Shelter was no longer a guarantee. When air raid sirens screamed through the night, women carried their children into basements and underground tunnels, praying the bombs would fall somewhere else. Every explosion shook the ground and their sense of tomorrow. Some women lost their homes repeatedly, moving from one ruined town to another, holding on to their families with nothing but determination. But the most terrifying battles were the ones fought in silence. As armies moved through villages, women hid in attics, barns, and underground cellars, trying to remain invisible. Many carried their children under blankets, teaching them to breathe quietly, because a single cry could invite danger. War taught them a cruel lesson: silence could save a life. In resistance networks, women used their courage as their only weapon. They smuggled messages, hid fugitives, and transported food across heavily guarded roads. Every step they took risked torture or execution. Yet they kept going, not because they were soldiers, but because they refused to let darkness win. In Asia, women living under Japanese occupation faced brutal crackdowns. Curfews turned cities into silent prisons. Soldiers raided homes without warning, searching for men, valuables, or anyone suspected of disloyalty. Women learned to read danger in footsteps, in shadows, even in the tone of a soldier's voice. Suspicion was everywhere. Trust vanished. For millions, family became the last fragile anchor. When fathers and sons disappeared into camps or battlefields, it was the women who kept households alive. They repaired clothes, rebuilt walls, and cared for the wounded with whatever herbs or scraps they could find. Their hands stitched together more than fabric. They kept humanity from falling apart. The world often remembers the war through maps and military strategies. But for women, it was lived moment to moment, finding food, keeping children quiet, staying hidden, holding on to hope. Every day was a test, every night a silent prayer. This chapter of their story isn't written in textbooks. It survives in memories, in whispered family stories, in the quiet strength passed from one generation to the next. Because for women in World War II, survival wasn't an achievement. It was a miracle they had, the hidden war inside the camps. For millions of women, World War II's nightmare reached its darkest point behind barbed wire. The concentration camps, labor camps, and prison camps scattered across Europe and Asia were not just places of punishment. They were factories of suffering. Where survival depended on strength no human should ever be asked to show. The moment women arrived, everything was taken from them. Their clothes, their names, their identities. A number was stamped onto their skin, replacing the life they once had. Mothers were separated from daughters, sisters torn apart, friends pushed into different lines with no chance to say goodbye. Many never reunited again. Inside the camps, every day began with fear. Women woke to the sound of guards shouting, dogs barking, and the cold sting of morning air. They stood for hours during roll calls, even in freezing temperatures, because collapsing wasn't an option. Those who fell were dragged away, never to return. Hunger wasn't just constant. It was weaponized. A single piece of hard, stale bread had to last an entire day. Some women shared, some starved, and many gave their rations to their children, choosing hunger over watching a child suffer. Work inside the camps was brutal. Women carried heavy stones, pushed carts, dug trenches, and stitched uniforms until their fingers bled. Illness spread quickly, and without medicine, a simple fever could become a death sentence. Still, women formed small sisterhoods, looking after one another, sharing whatever scraps of hope they had left. But the psychological torment was just as cruel. Guards humiliated women to break their spirits, cutting their hair, mocking their faith, threatening their families. For many, the greatest fear was not death, but forgetting who they were before the gates closed behind them. In some camps, secret acts of resistance kept humanity alive. Women hid bread under their clothes for others. They whispered songs from memory. They shared stories of the world outside, reminding each other that life still existed beyond the fences. These tiny acts, invisible to history, were the only tools they had to fight back in Asia. Women trapped in Japanese-run camps faced similar horrors: forced labor, starvation, and constant surveillance. Many were arrested simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their days were filled with digging ditches, carrying supplies, or cleaning military outposts under harsh orders. Yet even in the darkest corners, women held on to hope. Some mothers protected their children by inventing stories about heroes, angels, or faraway lands. Others prayed silently, trusting that one day the gates would open. And when liberation finally came, many women were so weak they could barely walk. Yet they stepped forward, carrying a strength the world still struggles to understand. The war may have ended, but the memories of the camps never left them. While millions of women suffered in silence, thousands more stepped directly into the heart of danger. They were not trained soldiers, yet the war pushed them into roles that demanded unimaginable bravery. These women became spies, couriers, medics, resistance leaders, and silent heroes whose courage changed the course of history. Across Europe, resistance movements quietly grew in basements, safe houses, and abandoned buildings. And in almost every cell, women played a vital role. They carried coded messages hidden inside their clothing, smuggled weapons under baskets of bread, and guided Allied pilots through forests and mountains. Every mission was a risk. Every wrong step meant arrest or execution. Yet they continued, knowing their small acts of defiance could save entire cities. Some women used invisibility as their greatest weapon. Soldiers rarely suspected them, allowing them to slip through checkpoints with information that could change the outcome of battles. They memorized routes, passwords, drop points, because writing anything down was too dangerous. Their minds became the maps of the underground war. In the Soviet Union, women joined sniper units, aviation regiments, and medical battalions. They crawled through snowfields, survived brutal winters, and fought on front lines filled with smoke and fire. The Night Witches, an all-women bomber regiment, flew silent wooden planes in the dark, dropping bombs on enemy positions with astonishing precision. Their courage earned them fear and respect in equal measure. In Asia, women worked as guides, scouts, and medics for resistance forces fighting against Japanese occupation. Many carried supplies over mountains, tended to wounded fighters, and provided shelter to guerrilla units. Behind every successful ambush or escape, there was often a woman who risked everything to make it possible. Nurses, too, lived through a war every day. They treated shattered bodies, soothed the dying, and worked with blood-soaked hands while bombs shook hospital walls. They slept in hallways, ate little, and often held the hands of soldiers taking their final breaths. Their strength was quiet but unbreakable. But heroism had a heavy price. Women who were captured by enemy forces faced brutal interrogations and torture. Many never returned home, and those who did carried emotional wounds the world could not see. Even after proving their bravery, many were forgotten when peace returned. Awards went to generals. History remembered battles, not the women who helped win them. Yet their legacy survives in the freedom their acts protected. These women were the invisible backbone of resistance movements, the silent defenders of their nations. Their courage did not come from weapons or uniforms. It came from an inner strength forged by necessity and fueled by hope. The world often remembers World War II through the lens of armies and leaders. The war that followed, after the war. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world celebrated victory. Streets filled with cheers, flags waved, soldiers returned home. But for millions of women, the nightmare did not end. Their war continued long after the treaties were signed, long after the world tried to move on. Many women returned to homes that no longer existed. Bombs had erased entire neighborhoods, leaving behind only ashes and memories. Mothers stood among ruins, searching for anything familiar, a piece of a wall, a burned toy, a broken photograph. Survival had been their mission during the war. Rebuilding became their mission after it. Women who had worked in factories, hospitals, and resistance movements were suddenly told to step aside. Countries wanted to return to normal, and normal meant pushing women back into the kitchen. Their courage, their sacrifices, and their leadership were quietly erased. The hands that kept nations alive were now expected to disappear from public life without thanks, without recognition. The emotional scars ran even deeper. Women who had endured violence, captivity, and trauma struggled in silence. There were no support groups, no therapy, no language to describe what they had survived. Many kept their stories hidden for decades, afraid of judgment or disbelief. They tried to rebuild families while carrying memories too heavy to share. Some women faced a different kind of pain, the loss of the men they loved. Widows raised children alone, working multiple jobs, patching clothes, boiling soup from scraps, doing everything possible to give their children a future. Their strength became the foundation on which post-war societies were rebuilt. For survivors of camps and forced labor, the world outside the barbed wire was shockingly unfamiliar. Freedom felt overwhelming. They had to relearn how to eat, how to walk without fear, how to sleep without nightmares. Many returned to find their families gone forever. They began new lives with empty hands but unbreakable spirits. In Asia, women who had been taken into comfort stations returned home carrying deep wounds, physical, emotional, and social. Many were rejected by their communities, blamed for experiences they never chose. Their silence became their shield. And only decades later did the world begin to listen to their suffering. But amid all the pain, women also became architects of peace. They rebuilt schools, reopened markets, replanted fields, and taught children about a future without hate. They stitched together broken societies with patience and resilience. In many cities, women formed organizations to support widows, rebuild communities, and care for orphans. They were the unseen engine, driving the recovery of entire nations. The world often says, World War II ended in 1945, but for women, it lingered in their hearts, their homes, and their memories. It shaped the way they raised their children. It shaped the way nations rebuilt themselves, the forgotten voices of a broken generation. As the world entered the years after World War II, something unexpected happened. The stories of women who lived through the war began to fade, not because they were unimportant, but because no one asked to hear them. Governments wrote their own versions of victory, Historians focused on battles and generals, and nations tried to forget the horrors they had witnessed. In that silence, an entire generation of women disappeared from the pages of history. Many women struggled with identities that no longer matched the world around them. They had been leaders, fighters, workers, and protectors, but now, society wanted them to be quiet, gentle, and obedient. Their wartime strength didn't fit the post-war picture. They had changed forever, yet they were asked to pretend nothing had happened. In countries across Europe and Asia, women carried secrets they could not speak aloud. Some had survived camps, some had lost children, some had endured violence they never wanted to recall. They woke up at night shaking from memories of footsteps, sirens, and screams. But when morning came, they put on a calm face and continued with life because there was no space for their pain. These women built new routines, but the past stayed with them. The sound of airplanes could trigger fear. An unexpected knock on the door could send their hearts racing. Many avoided crowds, loud voices, or dark streets. Trauma didn't end when the war ended. It simply lived inside them quietly, day after day. Yet even in their silence, they shaped the world in ways people rarely acknowledge. They raised children who grew up understanding the value of peace. They taught future generations about compassion, resilience, and the cost of hatred. Many families survived because of their sacrifices, but those sacrifices were rarely discussed. In some countries, women finally began to speak decades later. Survivors of camps, forced labor, and wartime violence stepped forward with trembling voices, breaking the silence that had haunted them for so long. Their testimonies became a bridge between the past and the present, reminding the world that these atrocities were not stories, but lived experiences others never had the chance to speak. Their memories were buried with them, leaving behind only fragments, letters, diaries, pieces of old photographs. Their voices faded, but their impact remained, written in the lives of the people they raised and protected. As historians began to revisit the war, a powerful truth emerged. No account of World War II is complete without the voices of women. Their suffering reshaped families. Their courage fueled resistance movements, and their resilience rebuilt nations. When stories are ignored, history becomes incomplete, and when the world finally listens to the women of World War II, a deeper, more human truth emerges, one that honors not just battles and victories. By the time the world stepped into the late 20th century, something profound had begun to happen. The experiences of women during World War II, once hidden in silence, started shaping. New movements, new laws, and a new understanding of equality. The war had taken everything from them, yet it also transformed them into symbols of strength the world could no longer ignore. For decades, these women had carried their memories quietly, but slowly their stories found their way into books, films, classrooms, and museums. Survivors who once stayed silent began to speak. They told the world about hunger, loss, resistance, and courage. Their voices, fragile but powerful, forced nations to confront the parts of history they had avoided. In many countries, the role women played during the war created a shift that could no longer be reversed. They had run factories, driven ambulances, broken secret codes, and fought in resistance networks. When peace returned, society wanted them to go back to traditional roles, but the world had seen what they were capable of. Women had proved they could stand at the front lines of danger and the front lines of progress. This silent revolution shaped generations to come. Daughters grew up watching their mothers rebuild shattered homes, handle finances, and make decisions that once belonged only to men. Sons witnessed their mothers' resilience and learned to value strength in all forms, not just physical, but emotional and moral. Entire cultures began to rethink what a woman could be. Their stories also laid the foundation for modern human rights movements. Survivors of wartime violence sparked global discussions about justice, accountability, and the need to protect women in conflict zones. International courts began to recognize wartime abuse as a crime. For the first time in history, the suffering of women during war was no longer invisible. It was evidence, testimony, truth. In Asia, women who had been silenced for decades finally demanded recognition. Their courage inspired activists around the world, proving that even the deepest wounds could become sources of strength. In Europe, the resistance fighters, factory workers, and medics became symbols of national pride. Statues, memorials, and archives began to include their names, names that had once been forgotten. Around the world, the daughters and granddaughters of these women carried their legacy forward. They pursued education, careers, leadership roles, all built on the foundation of resilience laid during the war. But perhaps the most important part of this legacy is the lesson it teaches humanity. That in every war, the suffering of women reveals the true cost of conflict. Their experiences remind the world why peace matters, why justice matters, and why remembering history is essential. The women of World War II were not just victims. They were survivors, protectors, rebels, and builders. Remembering the women the world nearly forgot. As time moves forward, the echoes of World War II grow quieter. The survivors have grown old, many of them gone, and the places where the war was fought have been rebuilt into cities filled with life. But the experiences of the women who lived through that darkness still whisper through history, reminding us of a truth the world must never forget. These women did not choose to be heroes. They did not volunteer for suffering or sacrifice. They were ordinary daughters, mothers, sisters, and wives whose lives were violently reshaped by events far beyond their control. And yet, when the world collapsed around them, they rose with a strength that continues to inspire generations. Their memories live in the stories passed down quietly at dinner tables, in faded diaries hidden in drawers, in photographs where their smiles hide the pain they once endured, in the courage they taught their children without ever speaking of what they survived. Today, historians are finally uncovering what was long ignored: that the war's impact cannot be understood without the voices of women. They were the silent workforce that fueled nations, the invisible resistance that weakened enemy powers, the caretakers who preserved life, and the survivors who carried humanity through its darkest chapter. Their contributions were not small, they were foundational. But remembering them is not just about honoring the past, it is about shaping the future. Their stories teach us that war does not end when the fighting stops. Its wounds linger in families, in cultures, and in the souls of those who lived through it. They remind us that peace is fragile, that violence leaves deep scars, and that the true cost of war is paid not only by soldiers, but by the women who stand behind them, beside them, and often completely alone. The women of World War II also teach us something else: resilience. They survived hunger, persecution, loss, and fear, yet they did not let the world fall apart. They rebuilt homes from rubble, raised children with hope instead of hate, and stitched together communities that had been shattered. Their legacy is not written in monuments or textbooks alone. It is written in the strength of every woman today who refuses to be silent, who stands for justice, who endures hardship, who dares to dream. Because somewhere in her story lives the spirit of a woman who survived the war. And so this documentary closes with a simple truth: the world we live in today exists because women, forgotten, overlooked, and underestimated, held it together when everything else broke. Their courage deserves more than a chapter in history. It deserves to be remembered, honored, and carried forward. The women of World War II were not just witnesses to history. They were the reason the world recovered from it.